Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at this workshop. My name is Cheryl Laskowski, and I oversee the Low Carbon Fuel Standard program here at CARB. We are going to have a CARB presentation followed by external presentations on the topics for today. We are also recording this presentation and we'll post it online to our workshops page. Presenting today is Jeff Kessler, who I will hand it to introduce himself and start the presentation. Jeff?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us at the workshop today. I'm Jeff Kessler and I'll be coordinating the workshop. And we have a bunch of pretty interesting things to discuss today, which is primarily the auto acceleration mechanism and step-down design considerations for the program. And so with that, I think we can get started. So the staff presentation is going to provide a brief overview of auto acceleration mechanism design elements, and then we will finish our presentation by providing some concepts that staff have developed. We appreciate stakeholder feedback on all of the staff concepts. In addition, we have invited several workshop participants that had previously participated in the public comment process relating to auto acceleration mechanism or step-down design considerations. Our first panelist for the day will be Colin Murphy from UC Davis, followed by Mary Selecki from AJW, and then Graham Noyes from the Low Carbon Fuels Coalition, and Russell Dyke from the BTR Energy Low Round Outer panel. After all presentations have been given, we will provide ample time for public comment. The main objectives for today's workshop is to provide an overview of auto acceleration concepts. In addition, we will present staff's latest thinking on possible concepts and provide opportunities for outside perspectives to be shared in addition to the concepts that staff have been working on. Importantly, we are hoping to receive feedback from stakeholders so that we may move forward on design elements and draft regulatory text. This workshop today is on Zoom, which is newer for some of our workshops. So the public comment process will be a little bit differently. So if you do have questions or would like to share comments or perspectives, we invite you to raise your hand during the workshop. That's next to the reaction button, and then we will call on you and invite you to unmute yourself. All commenters will be given 3 minutes for a comment. The next several slides will provide details relating to the LCFS rulemaking process and where the workshop fits in. So the LCFS rulemaking process is the first major greenhouse gas regulation that we'll be bringing to the board since finalizing the 2022 scoping plan update. CARB aims to improve market certainty and to provide clarity for the market to support deeper transportation sector decarbonization that will be needed through mid-century to achieve the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. In addition, there are several new federal programs and funding sources that may be complementary to the program. Existing crediting opportunities and provisions of the LCFS are expected to be streamlined and modified to better align with the scoping plan. The current proposed rulemaking scope includes adjustments to the 2030 target and establishing post-2030 targets, mechanisms to auto-adjust the CI targets to accelerate investment if the program overperforms, which is the focus of today's workshop, incentives for ZEV infrastructure and capacity build-out, provisions to support scaling of nascent technologies and fuel production needed to meet future demand, off-ramping or auto-adjusting incentives where demand growth is limited, aligning investment signals with federal funding opportunities, and charging implementation provisions to support streamlining the regulation. This slide details the process for rulemaking development. Staff must first identify regulatory concepts and then conduct public workshops to gather feedback on concepts. As concepts move forward, technical analysis is conducted to better understand how changes to the regulation may impact fuel demand and supply, which in turn may impact greenhouse gas emissions, air quality, public health, and California's economy. Finally, staff will release a full rulemaking package. The next several slides help provide a background on the auto acceleration mechanism concept. In previous workshops, staff have discussed possible carbon intensity benchmark schedules through 2045. 3 scenarios have been shown, with alternative B achieving a 30% reduction in carbon intensity by 2030. As can be seen, the slope for the emission reductions change over time, while all example benchmarks achieve the same target by 2045. Many stakeholders have commented that the targets provided in these scenarios are not sufficiently ambitious in the near term, and that provisions may be necessary to ensure that the program can support additional low carbon technologies in later years. There have been 2 main concepts that have come forward: an auto acceleration mechanism and a step down in the compliance schedule. An illustrative step down proposal is shown by the dashed blue line relative to the solid yellow line. A step down is a way in which the benchmark schedule calls for a lower carbon intensity in the near term with a shallower schedule after the initial step down. Stakeholders have indicated that a step down may be necessary to help strengthen investment decisions. In addition to a step down, we want to make sure that the LCFS can continue to support and accelerate the deployment and adoption of low carbon transportation technology, and that the LCFS can be more responsive to changing market conditions. To provide more market certainty, an acceleration mechanism can be used that would automatically increase the LCFS benchmark schedule in the event that certain well-observed market conditions have been met. If designed appropriately, an acceleration mechanism could allow California to more rapidly leverage future innovations in transportation and fuels to achieve transportation sector greenhouse gas reductions earlier. For an auto acceleration mechanism to be effective, it must only be triggered if well-specified, clear criteria are met that are responsive to market conditions. In prior workshops, staff have asked for feedback on the following topics: what market indicators would serve as the best trigger for increases in the stringency of the standard, and over what time period? How much should the CI target increase in various situations? And how should the auto acceleration mechanism be implemented? This slide and the next slide help provide illustrative examples for how different step downs may impact the low carbon fuel market. For these examples, staff looked at step downs starting in 2025. The current LCFS benchmark schedule calls for a 13.75% reduction in fuel carbon intensity starting in 2025. The graph shows 5 different benchmark schedules from 2025 to 2030. The linear trend is comparable to benchmark schedules staff have shown at prior workshops, in which the carbon intensity schedule declines by an even amount between 2024 and 2030. This would represent a 2025 reduction of approximately 15.4%. The other curves shown, 2% through 5%, represent how many additional percentage points the 2025 target would increase by. A 2% step down, for instance, represents a 15.75% reduction in CI by 2025, while a 5% step down represents an 18.75% carbon intensity reduction by 2025. These step down curves are aligned with many of the comments staff have received on this topic. More aggressive step downs in the near term may reduce the size of the LCFS credit bank, which may increase credit prices. Similarly, near-term step downs may result in additional supply of low carbon fuels, either spurring additional production or providing additional supply into California that may otherwise have been used in other jurisdictions. Staff used the CATS model to estimate the number of additional deficits that may be generated by more ambitious step-down curves relative to the linear curve shown on the previous slide. A 2% step-down curve is likely to generate almost 1 million more deficits over the 2025 to 2030 time horizon compared to the linear curve, while a 5% step-down may generate an additional 12 million deficits over the 2025 to 2030 time horizon. For context, the current LCFS credit bank is around 15 million credits. In addition to needing more credits to cover larger step-downs, a larger step-down also may make it more difficult for low carbon fuels to generate credits. This means that for larger step-down percents, California will need larger volumes of low carbon fuels or technologies to satisfy the same number of deficits. In terms of auto acceleration mechanisms, once a trigger occurs, it is also important to discuss the length of time that the benchmark schedule change would last. Some stakeholders have promoted a one-time change in the schedule when an auto acceleration trigger happens, while others have suggested that the change last in perpetuity. A one-year effect is likely to be responsive to short-term changes in the market rather than structural shifts. Short-term market shifts may occur due to unforeseen economic conditions, like a sudden increase in low-cost, low-carbon fuels for a short period of time, as could happen due to food or agricultural product surplus. Alternatively, a step down that lasts in perpetuity may be more reflective of fundamental technology shifts that have occurred, which were not accurately anticipated at the time the LCFS benchmark schedule was adopted. This may better account for low-carbon technology breakthroughs or more rapid uptake in low-carbon technologies, such as zero-emission vehicles. The next slides better cover some of the details that CARB staff have considered in relation to auto acceleration concepts. CARB staff does not believe that an auto acceleration mechanism can replace the need for regular rulemaking activity. It is important, however, for the program to encourage investment in low-carbon technologies, and an auto ratchet mechanism can help to achieve this goal. A well-designed and appropriate auto acceleration mechanism can help bolster confidence in the market, acting as a bookend to the cost containment mechanisms and advanced crediting provisions already established in the regulation. Appropriate mechanism designs should make use of publicly available and readily tracked data so that there are no surprises as to when a mechanism is likely to trigger. Furthermore, the size of the CI adjustment should be well understood and easy for regulated parties to anticipate. If adopted, an auto acceleration mechanism can serve to help shore up the LCFS credit market in between rulemakings. For all auto acceleration mechanisms being considered, there are two main components of the design. First, it is important to establish and identify the set of market conditions that would trigger the automatic adjustment of the carbon intensity benchmark schedule. And next, it is important to identify how the carbon intensity schedule will be adjusted once the trigger condition is met. Additionally, CARB is seeking to minimize unintended consequences affiliated with adopting an auto acceleration mechanism. Some unintended consequences could include an increase in noncompliance risks to the program. Additionally, a poorly designed auto acceleration mechanism could increase the possibility of market manipulation. Finally, an auto acceleration mechanism could significantly increase the complexity of the program, making it more difficult for market participants to understand and value credit prices. And it could also decrease the ability for programs like the LCFS to be adopted in other jurisdictions. The next several slides discuss the first design elements for auto acceleration mechanisms, the market determinants that can trigger the adjustment. The main LCFS market indicators consist of the supply of credits and deficits. In turn, credit and deficit supply determines the price that LCFS credits change hands at, and expectations for compliance in the future. As such, transparent triggers are likely to be implemented using either credit and deficit supplies or credit prices. Both potential triggers can be used to implement the goals of the auto adjustment mechanism, but they have their own considerations. A price trigger would require CARB to define a specific credit price, which can be challenging to predict, and if written into the regulation, would require a future regulatory process to adjust. Additionally, if a price-based trigger is selected, this could distort the market if there is insufficient credit liquidity. A credit or deficit trigger, on the other hand, may reduce the ability for entities to bank credits. If the credit or deficit trigger limits the amount of overcompliance the market thinks is necessary to meet future standards, then this can increase the risk of noncompliance with the program or increase the program pass-through costs for the public. Depending on future innovation and low carbon fuel production costs, a credit or deficit trigger may also be insufficient to increase credit prices significantly enough to provide long-term investment certainty needed for deep decarbonization strategies to be deployed. For both of these mechanisms, we need to consider the potential for market manipulation. Finally, this discussion leads into a question relating to the important role of the LCFS credit bank. The LCFS was developed to allow for credit banking. A large credit bank acts as a form of insurance for the program. If something unexpected happens that jeopardizes low carbon fuel supplies in the short term, such as supply chain shocks or prolonged droughts, then the credit bank can be used, like a reservoir, to comply with carbon intensity targets in future years. Additionally, the credit bank allows for more actors to hold on to credits, which can increase market liquidity in any year, further reducing risks and improving pricing efficiency. When thinking auto acceleration mechanisms, it is important to understand what sort of impact an auto acceleration mechanism might have on credit banking and how that change may translate to credit market risks. Should an implemented auto acceleration mechanism set a limit to the amount of credits that can be banked? What is a healthy bank size or bank level, and how might that change over time? While the LCFS credit bank has grown over time, the compliance obligation for regulated parties has also grown. A credit bank to deficit ratio provides some information relating to the number of quarters of noncompliance that a credit bank can cover. This is a reasonable metric to look at when considering the credit bank as a form of insurance for the program. Worth noting is that the credit bank grew significantly during the period that the LCFS CI schedule was frozen due to litigation. When the LCFS benchmark schedule increased, the bank to deficit ratio began to decrease. Since 2021, there has been a gradual uptick in the credit bank to deficit ratio. There's also been a drop in the LCFS credit prices. In addition to determining the metrics and approaches to trigger an auto acceleration mechanism, it is also important to define what happens when the market conditions for that trigger are met. This boils down to a question relating to how the LCFS benchmark schedule should be adjusted and for how long that adjustment should last. CARB has received comments relating to this, which has included suggestions such as adjusting the schedule by a flat percent or adjusting the schedule by a calculated percent or defined schedule. In addition, there have been suggestions to keep the adjustment in perpetuity, as well as to only institute an adjustment for a short period of time before going back to the non-adjusted benchmark schedule in the following years. The next set of slides covers staff's thinking relating to these auto acceleration design considerations. I will discuss two main design concepts we have been looking at. For the auto acceleration trigger, staff has looked at approaches that make use of publicly available data that are likely to be responsive to market conditions indicative of credit supply. Furthermore, the concepts we are sharing today avoid defining an explicit price. Additionally, the design concepts look to allow for the credit bank to grow as the carbon intensity standard becomes more stringent. The first concept is based on a credit price to bank trigger. The trigger can be calculated using publicly available data. It would make use of market information associated with credit prices without explicitly defining a credit price that would activate the trigger. The trigger metric can be calculated by dividing the average LCFS credit price by the total size of the credit bank in million metric tons. Because this metric is a ratio, it means that both the credit bank as well as the credit price will inform when a trigger event occurs. This would allow the credit bank to grow if credit prices are high, and would act to reduce the size of the credit bank in the event that credit prices are low, a sign that the market does not anticipate needing additional credits in the future. As seen on the next slide, staff think that a credit price to bank ratio, or CPB ratio, of 10 may be a reasonable threshold based on historic data. However, due to changes in the credit market in the future and current credit banking trends, a different threshold may be more reasonable going forward. The graph shows a calculated CPB ratio based on prior LCFS quarters. This calculation is made by taking the average LCFS credit price for a given quarter and the reported credit bank size, which is made publicly available. The dashed line on the graph shows a CPB ratio of 10, a value that staff thinks may serve as a reasonable trigger based on historic data. However, staff will continue to assess this value as we model possible changes to the rule going forward. We invite public comment on reasonable thresholds and other considerations. As can be seen, the CPB ratio would have crossed this trigger threshold during 3 periods. The first period is when the LCFS benchmark schedule was frozen by the court order. The second period occurred during the rulemaking process, which included extending LCFS targets through 2030 for the regulation that was readopted in 2018. Finally, we see that recently the CPB ratio has dropped below this level. As such, a threshold of 10 would be consistent with stakeholder requests to increase the stringency of the LCFS targets through 2030. An alternative concept that staff have considered is using a more simplistic trigger in which only the credit to deficit, or CTD, ratio is considered. The CTD ratio is a simple to understand metric. The CTD ratio is less than 1 if the number of deficits generated is greater than the number of credits generated. As such, values greater than 1 imply that the number of credits being generated exceeds the number of deficits being generated. Setting a CTD trigger of exactly 1 would significantly limit the ability for regulated entities to bank credits. For analysis on the next slide, a CTD ratio of 1.1 was chosen, which would allow for some growth in the LCFS credit bank over time. In this example, the CTD ratio considered would be averaged over a 1-year period to better capture longer-term market trends. As can be seen, the CTD ratio exceeds the 1.1 threshold from 2011 through 2017, and then again exceeds the defined threshold as of 2022. It is not clear what the correct threshold is for a CTD ratio or how many quarters of data should be averaged to develop a suitable metric. Staff invites public comment on suitable ratios and averaging periods to consider. This slide presents staff's concept A with different assumptions about the credit price averaging period. Similar considerations also apply to what was presented for staff concept B. Using an averaging period of only 1 quarter allows a trigger to be more responsive to current market conditions. For concept A, a 1-quarter threshold may be reasonable, as the credit bank already builds in prior years' actions. For concept B, however, the credit to deficit ratio would be reflective only of what occurs in a given quarter, which may be more readily impacted by short-term market effects. In general, a longer averaging period is likely to delay how quickly an auto acceleration mechanism can be implemented. This is shown on the above graph, where the green line lags the blue line. If the auto acceleration mechanism is implemented on a quarterly basis, then there are questions related to how to weight any individual quarter in a year and how many quarters the mechanism should look back. In terms of the ratchet, or how to adjust the carbon intensity benchmark, staff design goals have emphasized keeping the mechanism simple and easy to understand. Consistent with overall program goals, the purpose of an auto acceleration mechanism is to improve certainty in the LCFS credit market. As such, if the market trigger conditions are met, then it should be relatively easy for market participants to model and understand how program compliance may change. Additionally, staff is looking to ensure that an auto acceleration mechanism relies on publicly available data. As such, it is important to understand that there would be significant lag between the time that market conditions occur that might trigger benchmark adjustment and when an adjustment to the CII schedule could actually occur. This slide provides an illustrative example of a trigger that would be announced in 2026, with changes to the benchmark schedule being implemented in 2027. Due to the quarterly data release schedule, complete 2025 year data would only be available to the public in the second quarter of 2026. This is what would inform when an announcement to advance the CI schedule could be made. To give market participants time to react to this sort of announcement, in this example, the schedule adjustment will go into effect at the start of the following year. Consistent with the past slide, staff is proposing a simple to understand concept for changing the CI targets for the proposed auto acceleration concepts. This concept is to shift the benchmark schedule up by 1 year in the event that a trigger occurs. The slide also shows an illustrative example, which is different from the example on the last slide. For this example, a trigger event is announced in 2025 on May 15th. The CI schedule would then be adjusted for the 2026 year. The 2026 benchmark would now be equal to the 2027 year benchmark schedule. The CI benchmark schedule for 2027 would then reflect the new CI schedule, which would be the CI targets for 2028. Starting in 2027, another trigger could be announced based on market data from 2026. If a trigger were announced in 2027, then the 2028 benchmark schedule would shift up again, reflecting changing the regulation schedule to be consistent with the CI targets first developed for 2030. To summarize the staff concepts laid out on the last slides, both concepts would shift the benchmark schedule up for the next compliance period by 1 year if a trigger event occurred. The trigger event for concept A is based on a credit price to bank ratio. Staff has asked for feedback to understand if a threshold value of 10 is reasonable. The trigger event for concept B is based on a credit to deficit ratio. Staff has asked for feedback to understand if a threshold value of 1.1 is reasonable. Additionally, staff have key implementation questions that we are seeking further feedback on. Which trigger or triggers are preferable? What averaging periods should different triggers use? Should an auto acceleration mechanism only impact 1 year and then allow the schedule to return to its prior targets, or should it impact all future benchmark years? Additionally, staff is seeking feedback on whether or not the current LCFS cost containment mechanisms should be bolstered as well. Bolstering these mechanisms could help counteract credit banking difficulties that could occur depending on how an auto acceleration mechanism is implemented. This could be as simplistic as increasing the number of advance credits permitted to be used in the program to exceed the current 10 million advance credit limit. Next, we'll hear a handful of outside perspectives on auto ratchet mechanism designs. First, we'll turn to Colin Murphy from UC Davis. And please give me a minute to stop this slide and start sharing the new one.
All right, thank you, Jeff. While you get the slides up, thank you for the presentation and also to the CARB staff for the opportunity to speak on this topic. And I'm seeing my slides. All right. We're not in presentation view right now. It's showing the. Cool. There we go. Okay, thank you. So like Jeff said, my name is Colin Murphy. I'm the Deputy Director for the Policy Institute for Energy, Environment, and the Economy at UC Davis, and I co-lead the Low Carbon Fuel Policy Research Group here. Next slide, please. Before we get in, I definitely want to recognize that the work I'm discussing today is a team effort. There's no way it's been done alone, so I really want to recognize Dr. Julie Whitcover, who co-leads the Low Carbon Fuel Policy Group with me, as well as Dr. Jinwook Rowe, a postdoc in our lab, and our grad students, Pedro Orozco and Ray Kang. A couple of quick disclaimers. First, neither the Policy Institute nor any part of UC Davis are taking any formal position on the LCFS. We're a university. We're here to provide advice and bring science to the process. Any opinions I express that are purely mine, I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of the UC in any formal way. And also want to acknowledge the funding that supported the research that we're presenting here was provided by the STEPS Plus Energy Futures Program, as well as a California State Resilient and Innovative Ability, or RIMI, carbon neutrality grant. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through sort of three main areas that kind of mirror things that Jeff talked about in his presentation, some thoughts on the design of the trigger mechanisms, some thoughts on design of the reduction mechanisms, and then some thoughts on overall program ambition and how the trigger mechanism could, or actually the full auto acceleration mechanism could affect program ambition and what implications that has in the long run. Next slide, please. So a quick overview of the problem, and I think Jeff covered this quite well, so I don't have to spend a lot of time here. To make the LCFS work, you have to set targets very far in advance, which requires making a lot of predictions about the future, and those predictions are almost never going to be perfectly right. The targets have to be ambitious enough to create a strong market signal, but not so ambitious as to make the program unworkable or impossibly expensive to fuel consumers. And while CARB ultimately does have rulemaking authority and should and will maintain that rulemaking authority, it doesn't always allow for rapid response due to administrative and procedural constraints. And so we've seen that there is a number of cost containment provisions in the program. Jeff mentioned possibly the need to bolster those. Those really help mitigate the risk of credit insufficiency, but there's really no equivalent capacity to mitigate the risk of credit oversupply. And that's really what we're talking about here with the auto acceleration mechanism. Next slide, please. So talking about the trigger mechanism, we do a lot of modeling here at UC Davis. We're going to see some results from one of our models. We analyze the acceleration mechanisms. There's really no tool that I'm aware of that is really effective at analyzing the performance of different trigger mechanisms. Jeff discussed two, the credit price to bank ratio and the credit to deficit ratio. There's a number of other mechanisms that I've heard discussed by policymakers. Looking at sort of aggregate bank size or energy weighted average of the energy weighted average carbon intensity of fuel delivered. All these have interesting parameters. They need to be thought of on a case by case basis. A couple thoughts on trigger mechanisms, even though I don't have a specific quantitative model. Next slide, please. So first is we have to realize that there's going to be credit and deficit variability in the system. This is normal. Sometimes it is due to long-term trends. Sometimes it's due to seasonal behavior. The graph shows the sort of deliveries of gasoline and ethanol as one of the main sources of seasonal variability. And you see a really, fairly standard pattern. If you've been looking at energy markets, it makes a lot of sense. You tend to see gasoline consumption go up in the summer and drop at the start and end of the year. But you see in there's the big dip in 2020 that's due to COVID and the lockdowns that follow. And so one of the challenges is that when we see unusual market conditions happening, it can sometimes be difficult to identify whether we are seeing a transient disruption or the start of a new trend. And in COVID, it looks like we actually had a bit of both. There was a significant rebound of gasoline consumption after the worst of the pandemic was over, but it does look like there's been a significant and durable decrease in gasoline consumption, likely due to some relatively small fraction of the workforce starting to do more remote work instead of commuting. We're still not 100% sure whether this trend is truly durable or whether just the second half of the rebound has yet to come. So it's important to realize that when you are looking at data, especially on quarterly data, there's going to be some normal variability due to seasonality, and you want to make sure that you don't have an issue where a transient shock happens to overlay with normal seasonal variation and look larger than it actually is. So I think one of the possible solutions is to have kind of a double trigger where you are mainly looking to see if there's some sort of near-term disruption. So this is things like the numbers that we're proposing here are using the credit to deficit ratio that Jeff mentioned in his presentation. So you might be interested in having the credit deficit ratio above 1.1 for the most recent year, but I think it would also be useful to have a longer look back period, say the last 3 years, to make sure that this isn't just sort of like a rebound trend, right? If you have credits suddenly that have decreased due to, God forbid, another pandemic or another major economic disruption, you might have a sudden change that could be the rebound from a previous disruption happening. I think the longer look back period would ensure that what the program and the mechanism is reacting to is a durable trend that needs intervention rather than a variation that will normally sort of work itself out through market mechanisms. Next slide, please. And as Jeff said, I think the other thing to realize is the credit bank in and of itself is not the problem. The bank serves a very useful function. It reflects the past decisions by LCFS stakeholders to make investments, and banked credits represent emissions reductions that happened ahead of schedule. And this is a good thing, right? If you reduce emissions earlier, you get additional warming benefits, sort of a climate interest for the fact that the carbon was taken out of the atmosphere years before a nominal regulatory target may have happened. The other thing to realize is that, as Jeff said, as the program targets get more stringent, the number of deficits generated per year is going to increase a lot. So right now, as you said, our total credit bank is about 15 million credits. In 2022, we had about 20 million deficits generated. So that means our bank is about 3/4 of 1 year deficits. But by 2030, the modeling that we're doing projects that we're going to be getting over 40 million deficits a year. And a 15 million credit bank looks a lot different in comparison to a 40 million annual deficit obligation than it does a 20 million. So I think as we design trigger mechanisms, the goal should not be to necessarily run the bank down. It should be to look at structural imbalances between credit and deficit supply. Next slide, please. So now we're getting onto designs about the mechanism and how we're doing it. Jeff talked about a step down and then that step down moving toward a long-term trajectory. We didn't model that specific mechanism here. We didn't sort of get a indication of it in time to put into the modeling. We can do that and follow up later. But we looked at really two main mechanisms that are relatively similar. One's just add a specified percentage point or 2 percentage points to the target and then maintain that increase over time. And the second is what we're calling the pull forward mechanism. That is where, and this is similar to the advanced compliance schedule option that Jeff mentioned, where if the acceleration mechanism is triggered, when you go to the next year, instead of advancing to the next year's compliance target, you advance to the subsequent year's compliance target. So basically, skip a year in the compliance target schedule. So, the example that Jeff gave is basically the same one that I did here, where if in 2024 we see based on 2023 data that the mechanism is needed, the program on January 1st, 2025 would adopt the 2026 target instead of the 2025 target, so moving ahead. And these mechanisms can be temporary or permanent. You can either sort of have them in place for 1 or more years and then return back to the original schedule, or they can set a new compliance schedule, or in the sort of adder and then move to the long-term target, like the 5% step down that ended up at the same long-run target. You could have them return in that way as well. So there's a number of ways they can be structurally brought in. Next slide, please. So we did some modeling. We are going to be publishing very soon a report on updates to our fuel portfolio scenario model, along with a number of target scenario analyses we did looking at 2030 LCFS targets. In this, we used our 27.5 target in 2030 as our baseline scenario. This was intentionally chosen to represent a market that is oversupplied with credits. So do not take this as a our prediction or suggestion on what the 2030 target should be. We wanted to have a scenario that was going to have too many credits, so we could look at what happens with different mechanisms, different auto acceleration mechanisms. As a note, the FPSM is a fairly static model, does not simulate market response to the changes in targets. So all we're doing is we're looking at the effect of different targets, assuming that roughly the same amount of credits or roughly the same amount of volumes of fuel are coming in as a result. And then we looked at several different scenarios for how these mechanisms might work. And in every case, the scenario is in 2026, as soon as the full year data from 2025 is observed, it's noted that the target mechanism is needed. So it takes place in 2027. So 2027 is the first year the compliance schedule is actually altered as a result. So the scenarios we looked at our baseline scenario. We looked at a scenario in which the same target, the 27.5, occurred, but the ambition was front-loaded, because one of the things we're spending a lot of time looking at in this report is the timing and the effect of front-loading versus back-loading ambition. We looked at a permanent pull forward, so that is we skipped the 2027 target year and moved straight to 2028, and then stayed on the same trajectory post 2028 moving forward. We also looked at where we skipped the 2027 target and then held it for a year and then resumed the original trajectory. We looked at both a 1% and a 2% permanent addition, and then a mechanism I'm calling trigger and release, which is where you skip the 2027 target. So it looks like the permanent pull forward mechanism, except once the market goes through a year where it's in net deficits, it returns back to the original trajectory. And so one of the issues, and actually I'll get to the reason why this mechanism is important in just a moment. Next slide, please. So these are specifically the target schedules that we looked at for all of these different scenarios. So again, they start. One thing to note, can you hit the next slide, please? And one more. Get the text, there we go. And so one thing to note, and this is something that has come up in our FPSM modeling, is that once you get to 2030, you have to have extremely rapid target ambition accelerations for every year after 2030 for about 5 or 6 years. And this is to keep the LCFS program up with the rapid deployment of EVs. By the time you get to 2030, you're looking at 75% or more sales shares of EVs for the most part. So if you don't have 5 or 6 percentage points of additional LCFS target ambition per year, there will be too many credits and you will run into a massively oversupplied market again. So that phenomenon is held. We assumed a 6 percentage point target increase for every year after 2030, mainly so we could really look at the impacts in a vacuum and not really consider too much the long-run target implications. With the one exception of the trigger and release, the release mechanism actually happened in the 2030s. It's the only one where you had something other than a 6% per year target increase post-2030. Next slide, please. And so here are the results. The top graph is the credit balances. So that's the year-on-year addition or subtraction to the bank, and the bottom is the aggregate credit bank. Again, the 27.5% scenario was chosen as a scenario that was going to be structurally oversupplied with credits, so we expect to see that. And so what we see in the top graph is sort of the impact on credit banking in a year, and then what that does. The top is the impact to balance, again, year-on-year change, and the bottom is the bank. The table in the bottom shows the aggregate number of credits in both 2030 and 2035. I wouldn't worry so much about the raw numbers, again, because it's an oversupplied scenario. The delta, I think, is the important thing. That is the change from the baseline. It gives you a sense of how much each of these mechanisms ultimately can provide. So what we see is things like just simply front loading the ambition takes a few million credits out, as does the single year pull forward, right? When you jump 1 year in target ambition and then hold it and fall back to the original, again, it makes a relatively small impact. And I apologize about the background noise. They of course decided to install a desk in the office next door while I'm doing this presentation. The 1% and 2% permanent adders start to add a bit more. You're getting into the 10 to 20 million metric tons of total ambition by 2030, and a bit more as you get out to 2035. The permanent pull forward, I think, is frankly rather dangerous, because what this says is simply jumping forward that year. Even though in the first few years it doesn't make a particularly big difference, it brings that period of extremely rapid target acceleration forward and risks bringing it to a point where the rate of ZEV sales and really the market isn't ready for it. And so the permanent pull forward, there's a real risk that it overcorrects and will lead to persistent deficits over the long run, which is where I think this trigger and release mechanism becomes really interesting. Because this pulls forward and gets a relatively large amount of credits out of the system, but as soon as the market goes into net deficits for a year, it releases, it basically holds the target steady for a year in order to get back onto the original trajectory. And so this lets a relatively large year-on-year increase happen for a temporary period of time. And then as soon as there's an indication the market's not ready to keep the pace up, it goes back to the original trajectory. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. So thoughts on the acceleration mechanism. I think the permanent pull forward seems like really dangerous, again, because you're going to have these rapid target accelerations in the post-2030 timeframe. I realize we're only talking about setting a 2030 target right now, but the LCFS is going to be necessary to support the transition to carbon neutrality after 2030, and we have to consider the implications of anything we do right now on what the market's going to look like then. The 1 year temporary pull forward impact seems limited to a few million credits, and I just don't know if that's enough to make a real difference in the market, which is why a permanent adder or the sort of step down and then resume the trajectory approach that Jeff described, or the trigger and release mechanism seem to make more sense. The critical question when you're thinking about acceleration mechanisms is, does a credit surplus in 1 year mean it's more or less likely we're going to have an additional surplus in the following year? And there's reasons why this is true sometimes and won't be true sometimes. If the market is purely seeing a transient disruption, where there's a drought that is affecting biofuel supply, or a supply disruption affecting EV sales, where you might see something that the disruption's only for a year or two, and a relatively small temporary fix could be enough. But I think in more cases, if there is enough of a disruption that you need an acceleration mechanism to respond, then it's likely to be more structural. The very least, something that's going to last several years. For example, the impact of the COVID pandemic is still being felt. We still are not sure if we've fully rebounded, and seems to have had a structural impact. If there's a disruption in EV sales, or if EV sales overperform targets, those vehicles are going to remain in the fleet and continue delivering credits into the market. So it seems to me more likely that the disruptions we need to worry about are sequentially correlated. That means if a credit supply imbalance happens, the mechanisms needed in 1 year, it seems it's more likely than not it'll also be needed in subsequent years. And so that tends to argue for not a purely temporary mechanism, not one of these 1 year fixes. Next slide, please. So a last couple thoughts on ambition. And so these are our graphs that are going to be in the report that we're releasing. We're looking at the differences in pre-2030 and post-2030 ambition. So we're looking at it 27.5. 30F is a front-loaded 30% and a 32.5% trajectory. And then varying whether we take 5% per year or 6% per year increases after 2030. And what this graph shows is, if you have a lot of ambition before 2030, as in if you took the 32 or 30 or 32% 2030 targets, then there's not a lot of room to have the 6% target per year increases after 2030. And the converse is true. If you have relatively less ambition in pre-2030, then there's room to have more ambition post-2030. So there is a functional decision that CARB needs to make on, do we want to have ambition earlier or later in the program? Where is it sort of most important for the program? And I think the important thing to mention when we talk about this is that table in the lower right-hand side, which is the estimated fraction of gasoline internal combustion engines in the fleet. And this is under a scenario where we are seeing compliance with the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule and a robust transition to a predominantly EV fleet and to 100% EV sales by 2035. And even on those relatively robust EV growth trajectories, in 2030, 3/4 of the fleet is still gasoline internal combustion engines, and you don't get to 50% until a little after 2035. This means that even through the early 2030s, most people in California are still going to be exposed to gasoline price increases. And I think that argues for delaying the ambition to some extent until more people are shielded from the potential price impacts that higher targets would bring. Obviously, you want to find the right balance. I'm not arguing for an excessively low target, but I do think that there is value to saying that the question should be, how much do we need to do in order to stabilize the market right now? Not how much can we do, not how much ambition is tolerable, what is sort of the minimum required in order to create a stable, functional LCFS market. Because if you pile on the ambition now, you're going to be hitting a larger and larger fraction of the population, which is likely to, the people who own gasoline cars are likely to skew towards the lower half of the income bracket. They're going to be exposed to the price increases. And so as someone who has spent many years arguing for more ambition, this is a somewhat unusual position for me to be in, saying right now, perhaps not layering on as much stringency as possible would be a good thing. So perhaps letting some of the ambition get delayed until more of the fleet has turned over. So I think from the auto acceleration mechanism, that means we have to be careful not to let the mechanism add too much on, not to let the mechanism potentially push the system to its tolerance limits, and instead look at it as it's a price floor. It needs to ensure that the market is at least functional. And so I think that's the last slide. Next slide should have my contact information. Please feel free to reach out. We are happy to discuss this. If you have data or scenarios you'd like us to run through these models, we are happy to do that. And I appreciate the time to present here. Thanks.
Thank you, Colin. Jeff?
Yeah, thank you. Meant to share the screen. Next up, we're going to have Mary Selecki from AJW present on what they've been working through with their concept. So Mary, we're going to ask you to unmute yourself. And I will share your screen in a second. Great.
And I'm happy to share my video, Jeff, but it's saying that the host has stopped it.
Oh, if someone can change that setting, that would be great.
Okay, I'll get started in the interim, and maybe you'll see me appear at some point soon here. Hi, appreciate CARB making time for us to speak to you all today. My name is Mary Selecki. I'm with AJW. Okay, good. Video in operation. AJW's interest in developing this proposal has been rooted in the fact that we were one of the lead entities that designed the details of what is now the cost containment mechanism within the LCFS. And that component of the program gives the market certainty in the event of a credit shortage. And back in 2011 through 2017, a credit shortage seemed like the most likely scenario. But times change, and because the program has been so very successful, we've seen a huge amount of investment and credit generation transpire in this market. And because AJW clients are typically credit generators, we've long seen the need for more certainty in the event of this scenario, which is credit generation above and beyond what is needed to meet the program targets. To us, overperformance or performance above and beyond the targets is really a proxy for additional reduction opportunities. So we've been enthusiastic to think about how an acceleration mechanism could help further reduce emissions. Next slide, please. The CARB team has already covered this part in their presentation, but I'll just add that an acceleration mechanism is in keeping with the spirit of the original goals of the LCFS, which is to spur market innovation, transformation in transportation fuels. We want to make sure that success and innovation are rewarded. Next slide, please. So our process for developing this recommendation, we've used iterative feedback in a big way. As a result of our client interest, we wanted to wade into the design details of how this mechanism might function to provide more program and market certainty in the event of a significant credit surplus like what we're seeing today. So we've come to call this an acceleration mechanism because it would accelerate the targets of the program, but any name like a ratchet or an auto acceleration mechanism is great. We're more concerned with the function and the design details than the semantics of the name. So I'll apologize in advance. I'm going to use some additional slightly different terms than what Colin and Jeff have used so far. But we've developed these suggestions that I'm going to walk through today via iterative feedback from a lot of stakeholders, including many folks on this webinar. So I'd just like to acknowledge that this set of recommendations has benefited from the great collaboration by many of my colleagues on this workshop today. Next slide, please. So our initial scoping helped us land in a similar place to the other presenters. We found 4 key design questions that are outlined on the slide here: the basis for triggering a mechanism, the period of time that is assessed to determine a trigger, the magnitude of an adjustment, and how much lead time we all would receive prior to a schedule change. While these answers are highly interdependent, I'm going to walk through these questions one at a time. So we'll start with the first one. Next slide, please. What's the basis for triggering the mechanism? Under the factors considered there's ultimately 2 basic approaches here. As you can see over on the left hand, the factors that we considered to help us weigh these different approaches. When looking at the factors, simplicity, it's going to be an overarching theme of our recommendations today, because we think a simple acceleration mechanism, both in its design and function, will be the most successful. We want it to be easy to understand, transparent, and easy for investors and market participants to understand. We're hopeful that simplicity would equal understanding, and that in turn would equal marketplace confidence. In terms of the public data, we think this should be generated based on data that can be found in the existing quarterly credit summaries and nothing more complex. And of course, we need to make sure that the mechanism reinforces the goals of the LCFS. So then there's 2 categories of approaches which boil down to credit-based versus price-based. A lot of the folks that we talked with were market participants, and so there was a definite bias towards a price-based solution. However, after we walked through the list of the factors considered, and especially when we aligned with the goals of the LCFS program and this proposal, the credit-based trigger is our recommended approach. It's less volatile than price. It allows CARB to continue with its basic mandate, which is regulating credits and not guaranteeing a market price, among other assets. So in terms of the specific approach, there are at least a few different ways that you can calculate a credit-based trigger, many of which have merit. And I'll get into that in just a moment. But we want to make sure that any approach is transparent and that is also in line with CARB's goal of reducing CO2 emissions. Therefore, we think using data that is publicly available, like the cumulative credit bank, credit generation, and deficit generation, are the key variables to utilize in a trigger. Next slide, please. So utilizing data that is very easy to access by all market participants, there's a lot of formulaic approaches, and we did a little bit of backcasting here to see how such a trigger might have behaved in recent history, especially in 2021 and 22, when the credit prices were low and it was apparent that the targets could have been more stringent. But we didn't necessarily want a mechanism that would have triggered back in 2018 or through 2020, because the credit bank then, as was previously discussed, was relatively healthy to the rate of deficit generation. And as Carb and Colin discussed earlier, there is a valuable role for a healthy bank to exist. So we only backcast on the upper part of the screen as far back as 2018, because that was the end of the last rulemaking and the beginning of the program as we know it today. We tried backcasting prior to 2018 and realized that was simply a different program and it was operating under different market uncertainties. The LCFS has matured substantially in the last 10 years, and we found that only the past 5 years of backcasting provided relatable signals. So as a result of this backcasting, we threw out some approaches and we became fans of all the approaches that are listed on this slide. I will note that we did not tinker with the credit price to bank ratio that the CARB team presented, so I can't comment on that approach. But within any approach, what the specific level of formula trigger would need to be determined based on more comprehensive modeling. But these trigger approaches that are listed here are all interesting to us. Next slide. That was 2 slides. Yep, there we go. Yeah, that's the one. Thank you. Okay, so none of these individual trigger approaches seem sufficiently inclusive of the key variables. So where we ultimately landed was the fact that it's possible that a 2-test verification would be most appropriate so that you are capturing those 3 variables: the bank size, the rate of deficit generation, and the rate of credit generation. Because, for example, you can imagine a scenario where immediate credit generation is very robust compared to annual deficits, but what if there's an anemic credit bank? Or what if the bank is relatively large, but the current rate of credit generation is very low, and it's obvious the bank will be drawn down in the near future, hence wanting to incorporate all 3 components. Now, could there be other ways to algebraically approach this? Absolutely. Would they be better? Yeah, maybe, but we liked the simplicity of this type of approach. We would be supportive of other approaches, but we do think it's important for any approach to consider these 3 variables. Next slide, please. So looking at the duration of time that should be considered and whether or not to trigger the mechanism, we wanted to decide if this should look back on 2 years of information or 3 quarters. And where we came out is that the calendar year is not only the simplest, but it's probably the right amount of time. If you're doing less than a full calendar year, you're not going to fully capture some of those seasonality issues that Colin highlighted. And if you're waiting more than 1 year, then you're likely not going to be sufficiently responsive to the market and making sure that the baseline increases in a timely manner. In terms of the specific approach, a rolling 4-quarter approach ends up giving varying amounts of lead time to market participants. And I've got another slide on that coming up. You can go to the next slide, please. So then moving into the 3rd design question, which is what I think is the most important consideration, which is what's the magnitude of increased stringency? And our thinking on this has evolved a lot over time. In the early stages of this project, AJW was inclined towards a percentage basis because we wanted to keep this acceleration mechanism as something that was relatively small and incremental, considering that it'll be an automated adjustment. However, our ultimate sway factor of simplicity won out here. We're recommending a jump forward in the compliance schedule, because not only is it really transparent for market participants, but it's also very easy to communicate. For CARB to be able to just say, yes, the LCFS is doing really well compared to its targets. Therefore, we're going to be utilizing our 2024 targets during compliance year 23. And then as for approaches within the compliance year schedule jump, there's a couple of different approaches, and that's the continuous increase versus the freeze. A continuous increase is where you jump forward a year, and then every year after that also just advances by 1 year. As Jeff described it earlier, that's a permanent adjustment. However, the freeze is where you jump forward a year and then you pause and hold for a year so that you're getting back to the original compliance schedule again, unless there is a repeated trigger. As Jeff described it earlier, that's the one-time adjustment. And Colin also described it as the temporary pull forward. So we're giving you all lots of ways to potentially refer to these approaches. There clearly isn't a standard nomenclature quite yet. We can jump to the next slide. I'm only going to briefly mention the variable versus fixed approaches on the left-hand side of your screen, since we aren't ultimately recommending that. But suffice to say that we considered several approaches to how one could do a variable increase, including a percentage increase, including different magnitudes based on the current credit oversupply, or different magnitudes relative to the year and the size of the compliance target. But on the right-hand side of the screen, getting back to our compliance year jump, which is our recommended approach, for a while we were viewing this as a binary situation. Either you can have this continuous increase that can be repeatedly triggered until it has very substantial jumps compared to the original schedule, or with the freeze where you can only ever have a 1-year increase in the schedule, which seems possibly too conservative. So where we're landing is that we think the continuous increase, but with some guardrails or limits, might be an appropriate middle spot. So as an example, the mechanism could be triggered twice consecutively, but on the third instance, it would require some board oversight before being enacted, or a range of other review systems, but something to ensure that the mechanism does have some oversight if it starts to operate more than in the margins. The bottom line here is that we did land on the compliance year jump as probably the strongest proposal and the one that would give market participants the most amount of certainty and the right amount of signal to increase investments and continuously generate credits in the marketplace. So moving on to the fourth design question. Next slide, please. Fourth design question is the lead time given to market participants. Obviously, market participants need sufficient planning time before a compliance schedule is altered. We considered when data would become publicly available to the market, simplicity, and how to make this as responsive as possible. The buckets of approaches here were the annual assessment versus a rolling assessment. We're recommending the annual assessment, which would align with the same schedule as the cost containment mechanism, which follows in the years it is utilized, which is the previous year's data comes out at the beginning of April, giving CARB a 6-week window to calculate. And then the executive officer, or EO here, announces whether the mechanism is triggered or not by May 15th. And then with 7.5 months of planning cushion in the middle, the compliance schedule would officially change on January 1st the following year. So if it were triggered just last week on May 15th, that means this coming January 1st, 2024, CARB would instead implement the 2025 compliance schedule. And I'll mention that although this is 7.5 months of official notice, as others have noted, obviously, if the mechanism is well designed and transparent, market participants would be able to run their own numbers and anticipate that the mechanism would be triggered well in advance of an official announcement. Now, I will say there's a lot of things I prefer about the rolling assessment. However, it has some very unsavory variability, and that takes us to the next slide. This is a little bit hard to follow, so bear with me. But on the first table, we're assuming that CARB would only change the compliance schedule on January 1st. The second table assumes they would change it at other dates, and there's no precedent for that within CARB programs. So I think that we can basically cross that second table or scenario off the list. So looking only at the first table, consider if there was a rolling assessment, which looks back 4 quarters. Picking on the Q2 line, the data is available in the fall, and the official notice would come around October 31st. This provides only 2 months advance notice before the compliance schedule shifts on January 1st. Yeah, no thanks. But looking at Q3, it would be early in the following calendar year before the mechanism could be officially triggered, which would require waiting another full year before you could jump the compliance schedule, meaning well over 1 year would have passed since the triggering event. This slow response is part of what the acceleration mechanism is trying to avoid. Bottom line here is that the variability to a rolling schedule makes this option very unappealing to us, and we prefer the simplicity of the annual assessment. Next slide. So that's it in terms of my presentation. Here's a summary of our recommendations. I want to again thank my colleagues at AJW and all of you throughout this workshop. You all continue to be excellent sounding boards, and we are still fine-tuning some pieces of our recommendations based on our feedback that we've been getting from you all and this dialogue today. So I look forward to the Q&A discussion. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Mary. Next up, we have Graham Noyes from the Low Carbon Fuels Coalition. And so let me unmute you and bring up your slide deck. All right, Graham. If you can see everything, you're good to start presenting.
So it was allowing me to unmute myself. Maybe somebody clicked on me instead of Graham.
Very good. Thanks very much, Jeff. And thanks to Cheryl and the CARB team for making this issue a priority and dedicating workshop time to this, and for all the work that went into the CARB analysis of this. My name is Graham Noyes. I'm the executive director of the Low Carbon Fuels Coalition. I'm glad to present a view on behalf of the coalition on this acceleration mechanism. We're thinking about this on a long-term basis, hence the title, Charting the Path to Carbon Neutrality, and specifically really want to think about the long-term investment and to what degree the low carbon fuel standard is effective in triggering that long-term investment across multiple sectors. Next slide. The Low Carbon Fuels Coalition is a technology neutral nonprofit. Our mission is the support and expansion of low carbon fuel standards. And so we have members across the entire value chain here within the low carbon fuel standard. Of course, many producers, whether you're looking at liquid or gaseous fuels, project-based crediting, or the EV sector, as well as service providers and end users. Next slide. I think what's remarkable about the growth we've seen in the last few years is we are seeing some of the world's leading companies join the coalition. We take that as a message that this policy tool is being recognized nationally and internationally as really an essential part of decarbonization. And so we have the different producer groups who sort of not surprisingly are very interested in optimizing this program structure. But then we also see other participants, including engineering, procurement, and construction firms who are interested, obviously, in the project opportunities here, and then end users, particularly those with sustainability goals and decarbonization and zero carbon goals. that again see this as an essential policy tool. And so that's really guides our participation both in rulemakings and in legislative expansion across the country and on a federal basis. Next slide. So the kind of going at the fundamentals essentially here, one of the things that really stands out about a clean fuel standard as compared to tax credits and some of the other mechanisms is that it's a long-term program. It does not require recurring appropriations. It is technology neutral, essentially paying for carbon performance, not picking winners and losers, and creating a low carbon fuel competition, so to speak, to see what the best available, cost effective, practical solutions are there for decarbonization. It uses a scientific metric here, obviously carbon intensity, and then provides an opportunity for life cycle analysis to evolve over time as we better understand the carbon cycles, the carbon sinks, the carbon sources, short-lived climate pollutants, and the many other areas that CARB does work on. The policy is scalable, and its credit value by providing value for decarbonization supports investment in low carbon fuel technologies by sending the right market signal out there. Next slide. So the kind of key factors, I think, that drove the interest in the acceleration mechanism, and we commend AJW for its work in this sector, were indeed through the scoping plan, we saw the recognition of the low carbon fuel standard as one of the most important fuel policy in California, recognizing that it can drive investment and deployment. We also experienced that overperformance can undermine LCFS goals in that the credit bank surges, the credit prices drop, and the investors become unwilling to rely on LCFS credit value. And in particular, I've been working in this area really since the beginning of this program structure, and it was viewed with a lot of skepticism by investors as a revenue stream initially. Progressively, it came to be more and more trusted and recognized by investors, and by that we mean willing to take into account LCFS as a revenue source that would be reliable as you look at the investment going in and the necessary return on investment over time. But then when we see these credit prices drop, the inputs to that change, and the value is forecasted differently, and that can really change the economics of the potential project or investment. And then we also saw and we all experienced massive COVID disruption, as Colin pointed out in his presentation, causing a real drop in gasoline demand and therefore fewer deficits. And then COVID also made it extremely difficult to do the kind of public comment period and engagement that is necessary, and that we really appreciate that CARB spends the time doing and engaging in this way. And then also we see surprises in terms of crediting in new sectors and overperformance out there. Next slide. So those of you who have wonderful recollection will see that this is a little different from the AJW slide. That's because the AJW slide changed a little bit after I made my presentation, but I can say across the top that we support overall AJW's policy recommendations. We also appreciate the detailed analysis that ITS has done to provide input here, and generally the great work that ITS does out there. Our key recommendation was for there not to be a freeze, because that was an earlier proposal version had a freeze in there. So we're really glad that Mary and the team at AJW have removed the freeze and come up with sort of an interim proposal. But I still want to kind of focus in on why we think the freeze is not a good idea, and more importantly, why we're generally bullish on this being a strong mechanism that should be integrated into the program. Next slide. And essentially why we don't want to freeze, and we do want a strong mechanism here is because climate change is indeed an existential threat. And I think California policy has really recognized that and is implementing that. And secondly, the acceleration mechanism as proposed is safe. And I appreciate from the presentations we've already seen and those that we will see that there's a lot of subtlety and nuance around the optimal design here. So we don't want to get in terms of what I'm presenting to this overly precise or prescriptive. We want this conversation to play out, and we want the engagement to happen, and CARB to hear those comments and assess them as they will. But we want to be on the side of encouraging movement in this direction. Next slide. So just looking at this, and this is familiar, these were the growth years you can see here in terms of the credit generation and the corresponding value of the program, getting us up above $10 billion in total credit value, which is really a tremendous achievement of the program with that very strong growth curve, and then obviously the following of the program structure in Oregon and Washington being put into place, and now multiple other states with bills active this year, and even a much larger group of states looking forward. So we've got a great track record out there. Next slide. But then we got into the period of COVID impact here, and we saw multiple factors coming. And this is all from the data dashboard that's out there and the underlying spreadsheets that exist within the low carbon fuel standard data dashboard. And we appreciate being able to access those figures and the granularity of those figures. But you see, in terms of total credits, those moving up from 2020 to 2023 with increasing growth rates. So pretty flat in 2020, nice jump in 2021 to 16% year on year, very substantial jumps in 2022 and 2023. And that 2023 is obviously a projected figure that assumes that just the first 4 months was indicative for the whole year. We don't know that, but that's what it's showing so far. And then we see the credit value dropping throughout that period. Not surprisingly, this is a market mechanism, and the market's responding to the reality of the credit balance, so to speak. And then we see the market value dropping during essentially flat 2020 to 2021, but then coming down significantly despite this dramatic credit expansion. So that tells us there's less revenue that's flowing into the carbon value, the decarbonization factor here overall into the marketplace. And for those investors who are looking at the impact of that and the implications of that, they are sharpening their pencils and reducing the numbers in the pro formas, and being less willing to forecast strong revenue from the LCFS. Next slide. And so, overall, we saw the credit reduced by over 60% in 3 years on a per credit basis. So the pro formas, where the analysis is done looking at projects and investments, would be similarly discounted. Of course, that's that's up to individual investors, but a downward trend can be very challenging in that space. We saw that even though there was recognition within CARB in the market that CI values were lower than they could be and should be, that you just cannot make a rulemaking turn on a dime. As those of us who get into the regulatory details know, there are a lot of requirements involved in making rule changes, and particularly major rulemakings, and many of those just simply have long time hurdles. And as we talked about a little bit before, if the projects out there don't pencil, then the investors don't fund them, whatever type of project you're thinking about here. While we think the solution to this acceleration mechanism really steps forward and speaks to investors, we also think the step down is a very positive way to recalibrate things quickly. Next slide. And show the reason we feel like this mechanism can be trusted is because of the good work of AJW that iterated with CARB and other stakeholders, including the coalition here, to create these guardrails. The credit bank size test that Mary talked through, as well as the credit deficit ratio test, the significant lead time, the relative simplicity of the design, and the use of the existing carbon intensity table and transparent triggering. We see those as all conservative components to the proposal. And so we did not support a freeze in that we didn't think it necessary to slow things down after you had just sped them up, so to speak. And as Mary also pointed out, the credit clearance mechanism, the cost containment measure, is an effective ceiling. This is not a true floor in terms of a price floor, but it is a mechanism to move things in the right direction and recalibrate the program. Next slide. This is the what we call the NASCAR slide, meaning like it looks like the side of a NASCAR, but is just to point out how diverse the support for the low carbon fuel standard is. This is actually from work that was done with many groups, including the coalition several years ago when we were defending the low carbon fuel standard in the state legislature. And you can see how much businesses support the low carbon fuel standard. And so our recommendation to CARB is to keep up the pace of decarbonization. Next slide. Thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate the opportunity to engage here and look forward to future discussions.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Graham. So we have one final panelist for today's workshop. And so that's going to be Russell Dyke talking about step down. And so I'm going to unmute you, Russell. And then I'm going to share your slide deck. So hold on a second. Okay. And so that should be visible, and you're free to begin.
Great. No, thanks a lot, Jeff. I can see it and happy to start. So, first of all, just want to thank you, Jeff, and Cheryl, and the rest of the CARB team for giving me the opportunity to present today. I think there's been some great presentations. I'm going to focus a little bit more, in fact, exclusively on a carbon intensity step down in my comments. But before I get started, I just want to acknowledge CARB for the responsiveness to both our public comments as well as information that we shared one-on-one with you all during the last couple of months. It's great to see you as the regulator responsive and encouraging of feedback from market participants. So thanks very much for that. I'd also like to acknowledge upfront Asher Goldman from Net Negative Partners. So Asher's modeling work has been key to underpinning our analysis, both that we've shared with CARB on the CI step down as well as the acceleration mechanism, but also the analysis that I'm going to present today. So as Jeff said, my name is Russell Dyke. I'm the head of environmental products for Bridge to Renewables, or BTR. Before I get started, I just want to provide some brief background on BTR, our context and perspective, as well as the analysis that I'm going to present. So BTR is a technology-enabled platform that streamlines participation by EV OEMs and fleet operators, charging station networks, and renewable electricity generators in low carbon fuel programs. So we and our clients and partners have been active in California's low carbon fuel standard program through various of the electric pathways since 2019. So the perspective that I'm sharing with you today is really one of a credit generator in the program, who's very familiar with the way the program works and also very supportive of the ambitious decarbonization goals of the program. In terms of the analysis, I just want to make a few things clear up front. So first of all, our analysis assumes no changes in the LCFS program except for changes to the carbon intensity targets. So we're not including any of the other proposals that CARB has suggested or proposed in prior workshops. We're keeping it completely technology neutral in this analysis. Second thing is, our assumption is that all of these changes to the carbon intensity targets occur starting in 2024. So with that said, there's kind of three key messages that I really want to emphasize today. The first message is that when it comes to carbon intensity targets, the path is as important as the destination. And that's something that Colin alluded to, but it's something I really want to emphasize in the next few minutes. The second point I'd like to emphasize is that CARB has a real opportunity to, on a forward-looking basis, implement a carbon intensity reduction step down that really lets the ambitions of the LCFS program take the lead over the program's performance. And the third thing I just want to emphasize today is that this carbon intensity step down actually pairs quite well with the acceleration mechanism. The carbon intensity step down will be a forward-looking step that CARB could take. The acceleration mechanism is a backward-looking mechanism. But I do want to stress that, in our opinion, the CI step down is the most consequential step that CARB could take in the near term to really strengthen the ambitions of the program. So we encourage CARB to take that. Next slide, please, Jeff. Right, so it's not going to be news to anyone on this workshop that the program is currently outperforming its targets. And look, I think that's a testament to the success of the program. It's also clearly a great thing for the environment. We are outpacing the decarbonization of transportation relative to the targets that were set. If you look at 2022 as a whole, we're roughly sort of 2 years ahead of where the current targets had expected us to be. Now, if you extrapolate that out another 2 years, what you would see is that on the current trajectory, the size of the bank would double, and the carbon intensity, the realizing carbon intensity of the program would be almost 4 years ahead of the current schedule. To put that in a different way, the realized carbon intensity 2 years forward on its current basis would be similar to the 2025 target implied by CARB's Alt-C scenario. That's a 35% linear reduction by 2030. So I make both those points to really emphasize that CARB has the opportunity now to take a forward-looking carbon intensity step down towards 20% by 2024 on the way to a minimum 30% target by 2030 that really lets the ambitions of the program retake the lead over performance. And there are really four kind of key advantages to this. First, such a step down would result in an immediate inflection in the trajectory of the credit bank. That in turn would lead to an immediate and robust price response. I just want to emphasize something that Graham said, is that the incentive of the LCFS program is vitally important, not only to credit generators, but also to the investors in those credit generators. The third thing is that a CI step down will encourage a front loading of that investment. And finally, all of those things together will lead to both a swifter pace and a greater amount of decarbonization by the end of this decade relative to 2030. So just again, we're encouraging CARB to take a significant step down towards 20% in 2024 on the way to an ambitious minimum 30% carbon intensity reduction target in 2030. So let me show you what that looks like. Next slide, please, Jeff. So there's two graphs on this slide that present 4 scenarios based on 2 different metrics. So The graph on the left presents these scenarios in terms of the absolute level of the credit bank. And the graph on the right presents these 4 scenarios in terms of the relative level of the credit bank. So that's the credit bank adjusted for annual deficits. The first 2 scenarios that we look at are CARB's Alt B and Alt C scenarios. So those are a linear CI reduction, again, starting in 2024 on the way to 2030 of either 30% Alt B or 35% Alt C. The second 2 scenarios are nonlinear carbon intensity scenarios that have a step down to 19% carbon intensity reduction in 2024 on the way to either a 30% reduction or a 32% reduction in 2030. So focusing now on the left-hand chart, which again shows these scenarios and their impact on the absolute size of the bank. There are really 4 key takeaways. The first takeaway is that the linear 30% scenario results in a increasing level of the bank throughout the rest of this decade. The second key takeaway is that the linear 35% scenario results in a level of the bank that is rapidly decreasing by the end of this decade. If you kind of think about what that likely implies for price, I think in the first scenario, it implies a relatively low price for the next 6 to 7 years. On the other hand, in the latter scenario, it implies a price that by the end of this decade is probably quite high and rising. The third takeaway here is that in contrast, the 2 nonlinear scenarios immediately inflect the trajectory of the bank starting in 2024. And the last point I really want to emphasize here, the fourth key takeaway, is that both the nonlinear scenarios, if you look out into sort of a later part of this decade, 2029 and 2030, both of these scenarios result in a bank level that is either relatively stable or slightly rising. And I think this is really important, and it's a point that some of the other presenters made. The credit bank is an important element of the LCFS program. So we're not trying to minimize it. It needs to be around, and CARB and the rest of the market needs to make sure that that bank is preserved. Both of these scenarios would do that. The other point I want to make is that by allowing the bank to either be stable or growing into the later part of the decade, it really gives CARB the flexibility to then plan for additional carbon intensity reductions beyond 2030. So to put it another way, these nonlinear scenarios increase the likely success of the program in the short term by resulting in an immediate inflection in the trajectory of the credit bank. But they also set the program on a very manageable path to additional success in 2031 and beyond. So let's focus now on the right-hand chart, which again presents these same 4 scenarios, but this time looking at the relative size of the bank. So the size of the bank adjusted for annual deficits. There are really kind of 2 key takeaways here. First of all, as before, you can see that the linear 30% scenario initially increases the relative size of the bank before sort of stabilizing it at about 1.25 years worth of deficits. And as you can see, that's relatively high compared to the history of the program. And again, would result in an incentive that would be relatively low. And just to put some perspective on how that level compares to current levels, it's almost double the current bank to deficit level. So again, that gives you some idea of what kind of pricing environment we'd be in if CARB were to adopt a linear 30% scenario. The second key takeaway is that if you look at the scenario of a carbon intensity step down to 19% in 2024 on the way to 30% by 2030, you end up with a relative bank level that's very similar to the level that persisted between 2017 and 2021. And it shouldn't surprise anyone that the price estimates in the scenario are also broadly similar to the prices or the LCFS incentive value that persisted during 2017 to 2021. So this scenario would not push the program outside of historical boundaries, which I think is important. So these nonlinear scenarios are both preserving the bank while inflecting it immediately, but also leaving the program well within manageable levels for CARB. Next slide, please, Jeff. So I'd just like to emphasize, one point that I made early on, which is that we think that a carbon intensity step down in 2024 towards 20% on the way to a minimum 30% target by 2030 is the most consequential action that CARB can take. And the goal of the slides before was to really demonstrate that CARB can take that action without jeopardizing the program or without pushing it outside of historical boundaries. In fact, I think by taking that action, CARB will actually pull the program back within historical boundaries and help immediately inflect the trajectory of the credit bank. That will immediately lead to a robust increase in the incentive value of the program. That in turn will front load investment, and all those things together will help the program achieve decarbonization at a faster pace and a greater amount by the end of this decade. And just two final points that I want to make here. The carbon intensity step down does pair really well with the acceleration mechanism. I think they're very complementary. But I think CARB and the rest of the market, and certainly we, view the carbon intensity step down as the first giant leap that CARB should take, whereas the acceleration mechanism is the small steps that CARB can take down the road. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that any delay in implementing a carbon intensity step down after 2024 really diminishes some of the positive impact. And I know CARB and the rest of the market is very cognizant of the need for swift action. And I know CARB is trying to move as quickly as it can. But I guess my final point would be to encourage CARB to continue to move swiftly, to incorporate both the CI step down and the acceleration mechanism into its upcoming rulemaking, and really to put the program on a pace where the ambitions are leading again. So that's the end of my presentation. Look forward to questions. And Jeff and Cheryl and the rest of the CARB team, thanks again for giving me the opportunity to present.
Thanks, Russell. Great. We will move back now to our slide deck to cover a last couple of things that we have. And then we will move into the public comment portion of our workshop. So in terms of public comments, this is on Zoom. So how this is going to work is if you raise your hand, we will see attendees with hands raised. We will then call on you and we will ask you to unmute yourself. There will be a screen that shows up and you'll click the unmute button and you'll be able to talk. Once you are unmuted and begin, each commenter will have 3 minutes to provide comment. You can also, during this period, ask questions of any of the panelists that presented. We will be able to have a little bit of a dialogue and conversation around some of the information that you have heard. So with that, I will give it over to Katrina and Cypress, who will be leading the public comment section.
And thank you, Jeff. Before I begin the comment period or the oral questions and comments, I'd like to hand it over to Cheryl. I believe she has some words she'd like to say before we get started here. So go ahead, Cheryl.
Thank you. Mostly what Jeff said, but I did want to just take a minute to thank all of the panelists for their thoughts on what is really a complex topic. Our own staff have been thinking about this for a while, and it is pretty complex, but it's an interesting topic that we think is important, and why we wanted to present today and include the perspectives of others. So what I heard overarching was, some need for a step down and or acceleration mechanism, but some differences in approach, including maybe a 1 versus 2 tiered trigger, and then different trigger metrics presented by the panelists today. I did also hear some consistent themes, including the need for any acceleration mechanism to be as simple and transparent as possible, so that market participants all have the same information at the same time. So with that, I think we do want to continue to hear from others, and so we will take questions and comments. I do ask that you keep your comments to the topics presented today. And if you do have a clarifying question regarding a specific presentation, please note whose presentation you're referring to. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Cheryl. Okay, so we have a few hands raised, so we'll start with Sam Wade. Sam, please unmute yourself. I've activated your microphone and you can introduce yourself and begin.
Hi, everybody. This is Sam Wade with the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas. Thanks to CARB for a great workshop. I really think this is a topic that is timely. And I think all the presenters did a great job of dealing with very complex issues in a straightforward fashion. We're the National Trade Association for the Renewable Natural Gas Industry, and we have a strong vested interest in the LCFS. We agree strongly with BTR's presentation that a step down is the most critical action that CARB can take to signal that additional investment in low carbon fuels in the next few years should continue rapidly. We also strongly support the acceleration mechanism concepts, especially those brought forward by AJW in their proposal. We believe that the credit to deficit ratio is the most appropriate primary trigger, and that setting it at a threshold of greater than 1 is a reasonable starting point, especially when the bank is large, as it currently is. The bank to deficit ratio is also a helpful secondary trigger, because we understand that in the future, if the bank is very small, CARB may not want to tighten. And I think that's an appropriate addition. The sort of pull forward concepts, pulling forward by 1 year is appropriate if the trigger can be evaluated efficiently and quickly. And iteratively, as CARB is sort of laid out on slide 35. If we can't sort of do it quickly enough, we think we should turn more toward quarterly evaluations. But overall, the AJW proposal of a 1 year adjustment is appropriate as long as it can occur multiple times in a row. And you don't have to have sort of the pull forward of the entire schedule, just the pull forward of the next year's is appropriate from our members' perspective. We also agree with the Low Carbon Fuels Coalition on the need for swift rulemakings on target setting, even in the presence of these accelerator mechanism features. And we would sort of ask for the details on the timing of this rulemaking again. We were a little concerned to see in the CARB slides 2025 raised as the year that a step down would occur. Is it impossible to step down in 2024 from CARB's perspective at this point? And if so, is there anything we can do to alleviate that? Because the market is very focused on that year and would like to see this rulemaking conclude quickly with increased stringency. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, what Jeff showed is an illustrative example so that we could have a robust discussion here today, but I do agree that it raises some points worth discussing. First, we've been discussing that a step down could take place in the near term, but we haven't defined exactly when that would be. So it could be aligned when the new targets go into effect, but we are interested in hearing if that makes sense or if there are other considerations we should be thinking about. We're also still planning to go to the board this fall. However, rulemaking timelines can be very complex, and we might not make an implementation date of January 1st. So there's a potential for that. We're still targeting a January 1st implementation date, but we wanted to introduce that if that wasn't the case, having some feedback on that as well. So for example, if the regulation went into effect beginning in Q2 of 2024, we would like to get some input on when those new targets or a step down should take place. So for example, if we do implement in Q2 of 2024, does it make sense to do a Q2 or mid-year target adjustment, or would it make sense to wait until a full calendar compliance year? We'd also like to get input on whether we should consider a different step down based on when it could go into effect. So whether that's January 1st, 2024, January 1st, 2025, or something in between, does that affect the step down that we should be looking at? So potentially if we delay the step down going into effect by any amount of time, there might be cause to look at on the higher end of a step down versus if we did it on January 1st. And so we're looking for feedback on that as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl, and thanks, Sam, for your questions and comments. So next we'll go to Chase Lansford. So I have activated your microphone. Chase, please unmute yourself and you may begin. Chase, if you could please unmute yourself. All right, we'll come back to you, Chase. Let's move on to Tim Brown. Tim Brown, I have activated your microphone. Please unmute yourself and you may introduce yourself and begin.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, this is Tim Brown with First Element Fuel. Thank you for the consideration and all the presentations today. I'd just like to state that First Element agrees with the need for a near-term step down and that we support the provisions for the one-year consideration of a permanent, not frozen acceleration in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Let's go to Andre Templeman. I have activated your microphone. You may begin.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Sounds like it.
Yes, we can.
Couple of comments. I guess my one overarching comment, and I've made this a couple times, is to be a little bit worried about the whole pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered. I do think and agree with most people that we need to make significant changes to the program, including some of these suggestions. But I think that one of the things that is not been presented and that CARB needs to spend some time on is the cost of the program. As I've indicated before, my modeling shows that many of these changes could move us up to $10-20 billion a year of cost to the program, which at the end of the day, if you look at who's bearing that cost. And Colin kind of brought this up a little bit as well. Right now, that's the lower socioeconomic groups. And I want to make sure that we don't get some political pushback on, $1 gasoline, $1 a gallon gasoline increase as a result of some of these changes, which is what's pretty likely built in at this point. So that'd be my one comment, is just a CARB and everybody who's putting these changes out there, be cognizant of the cost and start to talk about the overall cost to the California consumer, because I think that's an important comment. Second comment I made, or I would like to make, and this kind of refers back to the comments that I filed publicly. I think it's very important, and I stress is very important, that the CI adjustments be made effective January 1, 2024. The market is expecting that, and if there's any delay, such as the one you just discussed with Sam, I think that could be very detrimental to the market and its confidence in this. And so one of the things that I recommended in my comments to CARB was a bifurcation. If you are contemplating things that are too complicated to get through for January 1st, 2024, I would suggest that you take the complicated issues, potentially some of these issues we discussed today, put those on a secondary track, and make sure that the CI reductions that are the sort of main fix are in place and scheduled and approved and implemented by Jan 1, 2024, because I think the market would lose substantial confidence in this program if those were delayed till 2025 or even halfway through. And that could have a very detrimental impact. So those are my two comments. The last question I have just for CARB, I guess, is when does CARB expect to come out with proposed regulations on this prior to the board? And will there be any more workshops relating to those proposed regulations?
Thank you. So regulatory text and the staff proposal is required to be posted 45 days in advance of a board hearing. So as I said, we're still aiming for a fall board hearing. And so it would come out 45 days before that, which means about late summer, you would expect a staff report.
All right, let's go to the next one. Let's go with Oscar Garcia. I have activated your microphone, Oscar. Please, you may begin.
Hi, good morning. My name is Oscar Garcia and I represent Neste, the world's largest producer of renewable diesel and SAF. First of all, I wanted to thank CARB for this workshop and for their work on evaluating this automatic adjustment on the CI. As you can tell, the market is really wanting this mechanism. The market has been overperforming. And so if there is opportunity to secure additional GHG reductions, we definitely support that here at Neste. So just a few comments. We will be reviewing the options reported or provided today, and we will be submitting detailed comments. But more immediately, we also support the immediate step down in the CI. The market definitely is requesting that. And we also support a frozen CI adjustment, which was proposed, I think, by a few presenters today. And so I'll leave it at that. And just remind CARB about the recent messaging from IPCC that there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And the choices and actions implemented in this decade will have impacts now and for thousands of years. So we really should take that, into account in this process and really push for the higher CI reductions that are possible. Thanks again for scheduling this workshop, and we look forward to submitting our written comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar. Let's go back to Chase Lansford. Chase, I have activated your microphone. Please unmute yourself and you may introduce yourself and begin. Chase, I still see you as muted. Please unmute yourself and you will be able to speak. All right, I don't hear Chase and he still is being shown as muted. So he was actually the last one. Are there any other, this is the last call for questions from anyone else. If you have a question, please use the raise hand button. And okay, I see Andre Templeman again. Andre, I have activated your microphone. You may begin.
Yeah, just one quick question. Do you expect any more workshops on proposed regulatory changes prior to the release of the document?
Oh, thank you.
I asked that, and I don't think you answered that.
No, I gotcha. Thank you. We are holding 2 community meetings next week. You may have seen a notice go out for them. Yep. That's kind of a new type of workshop that we haven't had in the LCFS before. So we're really hoping to get input from community members on the regulation. I don't think that we're going to be introducing any new topics. What we want to do is, well, I know we're not introducing new topics. What we want to do is really to hear or talk about the connection between the scoping plan and the overall state's climate goals and how the LCFS fits into that, and then talk about some of the provisions that we've discussed throughout a number of these more technical meetings and see where the public the community members are on that. So that's planned for next week. The presentation will be the same for both evenings, but hoping to catch a wider audience by providing 2 different evenings for input. And additional technical workshops are not anticipated at this time, given the timeline and the need to go quickly, as you all have voiced today and have been voicing for some time. We're trying to move as quickly as possible. There's a lot of complex topics still out there that we are working on, but we are trying to get comments in on this over the next couple of weeks and continue to develop our staff concepts so that we can put out some reg text for that 45-day public comment period. I don't see any other hands, so understand this is a lot to take in. And oh, Kevin Hamilton, do you want to go ahead?
Can you hear me? Okay, yeah, I would know if this question is appropriate, so I was going to hold off, but I'll ask anyway. So everything I'm hearing here seems very protectionist, and that always concerns me when we're talking about product development. We've been in this for quite a number of years now, and I just wondered, where is the mechanism? And it seems the CI is that mechanism where there's this thinning that occurs when the government is making investments in product development for a specific reason, in this case, to lower the carbon fuel intensity of anything that's going to power a vehicle or any other need for power. And you see that thinning happening as certain products become viable and begin to turn a profit, so to speak, and are able to, independently develop their own financing mechanisms. And yet in this program, when I was looking at that slide that had looked like at least 100 members on it in the coalition who have, I'm assuming, some kind of products, is there any hope of ever getting to the point where there's no need for this underwriting with credits for these particular solutions? I grant you that the program is useful and is developing really innovative ways to create energy for us. But it just seems like it's endless. And so, again, I don't know if this was the appropriate place to ask that question, but I have real issues. I'm an old turn, sort of an more older fiscal conservative kind of guy, and really skeptical about continued government support for products that should be, once developed, able to create a profit simply because they're the best product to buy at the best price. So it seems like this is not ever going to get there. Please tell me I'm wrong, or explain to me why I'm not.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I think, what we've been talking about through some of the workshops is that incentives might not be needed forever. That would be the hope as technology gets to a market penetration that makes sense and no longer needs extra support. Are we there yet? I don't think so, or at least not for all of the conversions that we need to get to zero emission technologies for our transportation sector. So with the scoping plan asking us to do even more quickly, that requires even more incentives over the next decade. And that's really part of why we're having this conversation. We're in a good spot that we're seeing overperformance, and that's great, but there's a lot more that we need to do, we think, to align with the carbon neutrality goals in the scoping plan. And so that's why we're trying to right size the targets, talk about the complexities outside of the LCFS that affect the drawdown of, or the lowering of carbon intensity of the transportation fuels. And we have talked about where the LCFS might not be the place to give support for every fuel or every current credit generating opportunity forever. And so that has been a part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. We do have we have one more hand raised. Letitia Phillips, I have activated your microphone. Please unmute yourself and you may begin.
Thank you very much. This is Leticia Phillips with the Brazilian Sugarcane and Bioenergy Association. It's just a comment, just really wanted to thank CARB staff for putting this workshop together. Thank the presenters today. As Cheryl mentioned, there's a lot to take in, but I'm looking forward to getting input from our member companies and putting together comments to share with you all. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Letitia. I am not showing any more hands, so I will pass it off to Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Katrina. So thank you, everybody, for attending our workshop today. So we do not have any more questions from attendees, so we're going to wrap. We will have our docket open to submit public comments to us until June 6th at 11:59 p.m. So you have until then to submit comments, and that can be found on our LCFS workshop webpage. And thank you so much, everybody that has spent their morning with us to attend this workshop. And so with that, I think we will stop recording and end the workshop for everybody.
Thanks, everyone.